Do you feel safer now? Or do old wounds still echo sometimes?
The lights were already too bright when I stepped onto that stage, but I swear the emptiness of the front row hit me harder than the glare of 100 spotlights. I had reserved those seats with a mix of hope and stubborn faith, carefully writing down the names of the people I once thought couldn't possibly miss this moment. My parents, who always claimed they wanted me to have something stable instead of chasing my ideas. My brother Mark, who had mocked my business as a cute hobby and told me not to get my hopes up, and Carla, my so-called best friend, who had ghosted me the minute my life stopped revolving around hers. I left those seats waiting, like little monuments to loyalty, and as the ceremony began, I stared at them in disbelief. They were vacant, glaring at me like rows of judgmental faces. I told myself they might still arrive late, but deep down I already knew. I had worked nearly a decade for this, scraping together savings, sleeping on borrowed couches, negotiating with clients who never learned my name until I made sure they couldn't forget it. I had been rejected by banks, brushed aside by investors, and ridiculed by my own family. Still, I built my company brick by brick, code by code, deal by deal. Now here I was, standing at the National Entrepreneurs Gala, clutching a polished envelope that confirmed my name had been chosen as the winner of the Innovator of the Year award. This was supposed to be the kind of night people framed photographs of. It was supposed to be proof that I had not only survived but triumphed. Instead, it was me staring at empty seats like a woman who had invited her family to her wedding and watched them all RSVP no. The host called my name, his voice booming, and the applause around me sounded both deafening and hollow. Strangers stood to clap. People I didn't know smiled as though they had believed in me from the beginning, but when I scanned the crowd, all I could see was that front row of emptiness. It was like a wound carved into the ceremony, a reminder that success in the eyes of the world can still feel like failure when the people who should love you most decide you're not worth the drive. I walked toward the stage in heels that pinched, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might rattle the microphone. On the giant screens flanking me, I could see my own face, composed but tight, like I was holding in something explosive. The stage manager whispered for me to keep it brief and professional, but I knew in that moment professionalism wasn't what the night deserved. I could feel a knot of anger twisting into clarity, the realization that if they wouldn't clap for me now, they would never clap for me at all. The award felt heavy in my hands, its golden edges catching the light, but it also felt strangely irrelevant. I was supposed to thank the sponsors, smile for the cameras, and talk about my vision for the future. Instead, I stared straight into the lens, my pulse slowing as though the words had already written themselves inside me. Tonight, I began, my voice steady in a way I didn't expect. It's supposed to be about gratitude. But I can't stand here and pretend I don't see what's missing. I can't look at empty seats and tell you I'm surrounded by support. So let me be very clear. The ones who never believed in me don't reach out now. For a split second, silence fell, as though the entire ballroom had forgotten to breathe. Then a wave of gasps, scattered applause, and murmurs rolled through the room like thunder. I didn't flinch. I let the words hang there, daring anyone to challenge them. The cameras zoomed closer, catching the set of my jaw, the glint in my eyes. Somewhere in the audience, a woman clapped louder and soon others followed, though I could sense the unease of people unsure if this was triumph or scandal. I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't speaking for approval, I was speaking for myself. As I stepped off stage, the event coordinator hissed at me about sponsors, decorum, and the optics of bitterness, but her words rolled off me like static. My phone vibrated in my clutch, the first tremor of what would become a storm. At that moment, I hadn't read a single message, but I could already feel the weight of eyes turning toward me, not with the soft gaze of family pride, but with the sharp curiosity of a world that feeds on drama. I made my way backstage, the award still in my hand, though it felt less like a prize and more like a weapon I had swung in public. I glanced one last time at the stage, those screens still glowing with my face, and I realized something I couldn't ignore. If my family thought staying away would diminish me, they had just given me the perfect opening to remind them, and everyone else, that I didn't need their applause. What I didn't know, as I slipped into the dark corridor leading out of the ballroom, was how fast those words would travel, how many people would see them, twist them, and echo them back at me. I thought I had simply thrown a punch at the people who had abandoned me. I didn't realize I had also lit a fuse that was about to blow open every corner of my life. And when I finally unlocked my phone, when I saw the flood of notifications, missed calls, unread texts, messages from names I hadn't heard in years, I knew that speech hadn't just burned a bridge. It had set fire to the whole damn skyline. I left the ballroom with my jaw set the way people set the edge of a shovel before the first hard thrust into frozen ground, the award tucked against my ribs like a slightly ridiculous shield, and the echo of my own voice, steady, clipped, and a little dangerous, still ringing in my head while the corridor swallowed the ambient applause and turned it into something that sounded more like wind through a deserted parking lot, which felt fitting given the front row I had stared at all night and the odd sensation of being the main course at a banquet where the invited guests had decided to eat elsewhere but still wanted to complain about the seasoning. By the time the elevator doors closed, my phone was already pulsing in that feverish way that tells you the world has decided you are suddenly interesting, which is both thrilling and exhausting. Because for years I had tried to be taken seriously for the real work and not the theater, yet here I was, the theater finally paying my tab. The notifications stacked like falling tiles, messages from former colleagues who had treated me as cheap labor until the invoices proved otherwise, acquaintances who once labeled my product a novelty and now claimed they had always seen the spark, old classmates who had perfected the art of congratulating without admitting the years of dismissal, and a scattering of strangers who wrote as though my sentence into the camera had pierced a private bruise they had carried since childhood, which, frankly, overwhelmed me more than the gossipy cheerleaders, because at least those letters felt honest in their rawness. The organizers were trying to reach me about a clarification statement, a publicist from a sponsor wanted to align on tone, and a tech podcast that had ignored 5 pitches back when I was buying groceries with rolled coins now asked for an emergency interview first thing in the morning, which made me laugh in a way that scared the elevator attendant because he looked at me as though I might start reciting curses or blessings, and he wasn't sure which would be worse. I should say that I am not naive about the attention economy. I built my company in a landscape where timing and narrative can move a product further than any lone statistic, and while I have always liked my numbers clean and my projections unromantic, I learned that a single crisp sentence at the right moment can open doors that years of careful memos only nudge. So as the car slid down to the lobby, I stopped reacting and started working, because reaction is a luxury and strategy is survival. I drafted a note to my small but viciously competent team, 3 people who had stuck through lean months, who had punched above their titles without whining, who had earned the right to see me messy, and I told them that the clip would break out overnight, that we would get both love and bile, and that we would answer the bile without flinching or flailing, not because we owe the mob a performance, but because our customers get steadiness from us or they go elsewhere. In the rideshare, while the driver narrated the traffic like a late-night sportscaster, I set up a controlled firebreak. I pinned a short statement on our company's page that thanked the judges, reaffirmed our roadmap, and directed press inquiries to a single address. Then I scheduled a midnight newsletter to our customer base titled The Empty Seats and the Full Future, which opened with gratitude for the people who kept the lights on during the years when I was assembling prototypes in a borrowed kitchen, and shipped with a one-night-only code that cut the flagship plan by 1/3 for anyone who had purchased before the gala, a not-so-subtle reward for the folks who did not wait for a camera to tell them where to stand. I named the code Scout's Honor, which amused me for reasons only people raised by parents who weaponized merit badges would understand, and then I tucked a soft barb into the postscript, an invitation to a small live stream for customers the following afternoon. The guest list capped and the questions open, a window that excluded the latecomers who were already composing their careful paragraphs about how proud they were to finally see me shine. You asked for revenge, and this was mine for the evening. Not screaming, not slamming, but a neat realignment of access. A velvet rope that favored the people who had stayed through the dull years and quietly kept my rent paid when the product was still an idea with a shaky chair beneath it. Yet I didn't stop there because pettiness is unsatisfying unless it also educates, so I designed an auto-reply for a new folder labeled Sudden Believers, which caught messages containing phrases like, always knew, so proud, and remember when we, and sent back a polite note thanking them for the outreach while linking to a public page on our site titled Receipts of Risk, a curated timeline of early purchase orders, customer testimonials, and partner commitments that had carried us through the fog, scrubbing names and addresses for privacy, but leaving the dates and the substance intact, a ledger of who had believed when it cost something. It was not a call-out board, it was a mirror held at an unflattering angle, and it did the job. When I reached my apartment, I put the award on the kitchen counter next to a basket of fruit that had gone from hopeful to tragic while I had been working too many late nights, and I poured water into a glass big enough to make a doctor proud, because my body was sending those shaky signals that announce a crash if you are careless. I sat at the table, opened my laptop, and audited the messages that had slipped past the filters. A few sincere apologies from people who admitted they should have shown up, some clumsy attempts to turn my moment into their anecdote, a tiny cluster of threats disguised as advice, and one note from a woman in Ohio who wrote that my sentence had detonated a memory she had not touched since her 20s, and that she had walked out of a church basement fundraiser because she suddenly realized she didn't need to win a raffle to deserve support, which was the kind of small human victory that makes the other noise worth tolerating. Then came the petty sideshow I had expected from my brother, who, according to a screenshot someone forwarded, had posted a photo of a backyard grill with a caption about real success happening off camera. The kind of damp philosophy that passes for confidence in men who were born with a safety net and taught to call it courage. I filed it into the mental drawer labeled later, because tonight's revenge had already been committed, and I refused to fight every skirmish when the war requires a rested general. I checked the numbers on the newsletter, watched the open rate leap in a way that made my chest feel both heavy and light, and then I queued a donation in Mark's name to a scholarship fund for first-time women founders at our state university. An amount large enough to be noticed on the public ledger and accompanied by a note that said, "For the grill master who loves off-camera success," a joke that would hit him the moment the foundation published its monthly roll, which felt like a civilized slap with white gloves and the tiniest bow. I was about to close the laptop when a new message slid into the inbox with no preview text and a subject line that carried my maiden name, a label I never used in business and kept sealed like a time capsule, and the sender field showed no address at all. Only 2 words that made the room shrink and the water in my glass taste like metal. From Dad. The subject line sat there like a dare I had avoided for years. A tidy resurrection of a name I had folded away when I learned that independence sometimes requires ceremonial acts. And although every survival instinct argued for putting the laptop to sleep and reclaiming the thin piece I had engineered through work and water and carefully portioned spite, my thumb twitched and the message opened into a single paragraph that landed not with the hysterics I feared, but with a private sobriety that hurt more than shouting ever could. Because it read that they had watched the broadcast, that they had seen the empty seats before the camera found my face, that my sentence had struck like a hammer and also like a mirror, and that my father, the same man who measured love in warnings disguised as practical advice, believed he owed me a conversation that would not be performed or postponed, which sounded almost reasonable until I reached the valediction and noticed he had signed with his first name, not Dad, as if to acknowledge that the title had been pawned years ago and might not be redeemable at current market rates. I closed the message without answering because a lifetime of learning the delayed cost of quick replies has made me cautious. Then I let the room fill with the low mechanical hiss of the refrigerator and the distant scrape of a neighbor's chair while my phone, the other metronome of my life, continued its nervous chatter about clips, takes, and think pieces that seemed convinced this single sentence I had thrown like a dart revealed the entirety of my psychology, which would be insulting if it were not so predictable. By mid-morning the next day, the clip had bloomed into exactly the hydra I expected, with one head wagging its tongue about bitterness and gratitude, another head insisting I was a hero of boundaries, and a third head mouthing questions about whether I had orchestrated the entire drama to juice sales, which, to be honest, I did not find offensive because a woman who has slept on borrowed couches learns to accept that strategy and emotion can occupy the same room without poisoning each other, and if my company benefited from a sentence that also freed me from the ritual of pretending I was loved out loud, then perhaps we could call it a 2-for-1 special that required no coupons. The sponsor called with that tone people use when they want to sound firm but fear being recorded, and I told them we were aligned on excellence, on delivery, on clean books and clear documentation, and that the rest belonged to the category of leadership choices, after which I sent our legal team a short note, confirming that we were within all contractual clauses and that optics, while important to brands that dress fear in sophisticated fonts, were not enumerated in obligations, which, as always, soothed everyone more effectively than any apology could. The backlash, however, did not stay politely in corporate corridors because the internet prefers kitchens and group chats where certainty is brewed like oversteeped tea. And into this mess trundled Carla with the exact message I would have written for her if I had been hired to ghostwrite her selective memory, a long, syrupy note about how proud she was to finally see me receive the flowers I had always deserved, and how she remembered those late nights when we made dreams on the backs of napkins and laughed about the lives we would build, and how she regretted that we had drifted and would love to reconnect over a celebratory glass of something expensive, which managed to be both flattering and insulting because it reimagined my sacrifices as a charming slumber party while airbrushing the year she dismissed my invoice as friend rate and the month she borrowed my developer for a quick consultation. That turned into unpaid sprint work. I stared at the message, felt the accompanying ache of old habit that wanted to smooth the edges and say maybe, then remembered that I had vowed never again to subsidize the renaissance of people who left me hungry. So I wrote back with an invitation to coffee at an independent shop owned by a woman who had stocked our product on consignment when no one else would risk shelf space, and I suggested a time that, with light calendar surgery, I made sure would overlap with a podcast taping I had already agreed to, a show run by a journalist who actually did her research and cared more about the unglamorous anatomy of persistence than the mythology of genius. I arrived early, briefed the host with enough context to recognize certain patterns if they appeared, and then watched the glass door as Carla entered wearing Triumph-like perfume, her arms open, her smile wide. Her first sentence a polished reflection about how we were always destined for more, and I greeted her with the warmth one reserves for a neighbor one hopes will someday learn to use a trash bin properly. Then I gestured toward the back where the podcasters were setting up, and I explained that we were about to have a conversation about the cost of support and the price of exposure, which withered her grin by a centimeter, but not enough to make her back out. Because the world is full of people who believe they can talk themselves out of receipts if the lighting is good. During the interview, I told the truth without sharpening it into spectacle. I described unpaid favors as the quiet tax on women who look competent in rooms that pay men for the same competence, and when the host asked about the line I had spoken into the camera, I returned to the empty seats and the feeling of speaking finally to my own spine. At which point Carla leapt in with a monologue about the importance of community and the need to stay gracious even when the world disappoints us, which would sound noble if it did not originate from a person who once charged an administrative fee to introduce me to a mentor I later learned had been my own client. The host blinked, thanked her for the contribution, and moved on, while I swallowed a laugh that would have unraveled the segment. But I had not invited her merely to watch her audition for a part she had already lost. I had, over the previous evening, done the unsexy work that revenge requires if you want it to carry more consequence than a clap back, and so, while the microphones cooled, I stepped into the hallway, opened my laptop, and finalized the purchase of a domain that Carla had once used for her boutique consultancy, a site she had allowed to lapse after pivoting to an online course that charged aspiring founders for insider templates, and I flipped the switch on a redirect that pointed her old address to a public resource page titled Builder's Library, a clean, ad-free collection of contract templates, invoice trackers, and negotiation scripts written by women and offered for free with attribution, which accomplished three things at once. It removed a piece of her nostalgic brand from circulation, it turned a vanity into a community tool, and it announced, to anyone paying attention, that I had no intention of wasting breath on debates about gratitude when structure could do the talking. I sent Carla a short note that thanked her for coming, linked her to the new page, and suggested that if she truly believed in community, she might consider adding her best material to it under her real name without a paywall. Then I walked back into the cafe and pretended to examine muffins while my email pinged with a fury that sounded like a swarm. I wish I could tell you that the little victory tasted purely sweet, but celery and chocolate often share the same plate in my life, and while the redirect did its quiet work, my phone lit with a new message from my father. This one shorter than the last and stamped with a forwarding header from an address I had not seen since college, a family account we had abandoned when the dial-up choked on modernity, and the subject line, without ceremony, asked whether I remembered the storage unit off Route 7, which made my throat tighten because that unit had been the graveyard of our unkept promises, and apparently he wanted to meet there on Sunday afternoon and bring something you once left behind. A sentence that felt like a key slid under a door I was not yet sure I wanted to open. Sunday came with that strained stillness particular to mornings when the body knows more than the mind is ready to admit, and as I drove toward the storage unit off Route 7, the roads unfurled in long ribbons of asphalt that carried every memory I had tried to compress into folders labeled unnecessary, too heavy, and deal with later. The unit itself was part of a crumbling row of corrugated metal doors, each painted a shade of dull orange that had faded under decades of sun and salt, and as I parked, I noticed how unchanged it all was, the same cracked pavement, the same chain-link fence crowned with coils of rusting barbed wire, and even the same fading billboard at the entrance promising security you can trust, a slogan that had always felt like the punchline to a cruel joke. My father stood near the unit door in a plain jacket, hands tucked in pockets, his posture not aggressive, but not softened either, the way people stand when they are carrying too much weight inside their own chest and have decided to let the silence speak first. He didn't hug me, and I didn't step forward to make it easier, because some gestures rot if they arrive too late, and we both knew the kind of damage time had already done. Instead, he produced a key from his pocket, slid it into the rusted lock, and rolled the door upward with a groan that sounded like the groaning of years themselves, revealing a dim rectangle stuffed with boxes, furniture wrapped in plastic, and one familiar trunk that stopped me in my tracks. It was a battered blue trunk I had left behind when I moved out in a hurry, packed with journals, photographs, and notebooks filled with ideas that had once been mocked for being impractical. The very same pages that had formed the skeleton of the company I had later built without permission, support, or applause. My father placed a hand on the trunk, not possessive but almost reverent, and he said quietly that he had kept it safe, even when he told me I should throw away childish dreams, even when he scoffed at the projects. He couldn't bring himself to let this trunk be lost, as though some part of him had known it mattered more than he was willing to confess. I didn't answer right away, because the confession hung between us like a glass ornament, fragile, reflective, and one careless movement away from shattering completely. He began to speak of regrets in that halting tone men of his generation often use when emotions are foreign dialects, telling me that he thought pushing me toward stability was protection, that he believed skepticism was a kind of shield against disappointment, that he had been wrong to confuse doubt with love. He said he and my mother had not come to the ceremony because they didn't know how to face the scale of what I had built without feeling like intruders at a wedding they had tried to stop, and that the empty seats had been their cowardice made visible. His words did not land neatly into forgiveness. They fell into me like jagged stones that might form a path only after years of erosion. I told him that words like shield and protection were excuses, that he had chosen to interpret ambition as recklessness because it frightened him to imagine a daughter who didn't need his permission, and that he had no right to call doubt a form of care when doubt had left me working nights with a stomach empty of anything but caffeine and grit. I said all of this without raising my voice, because quiet honesty often cuts sharper than screams, and I saw in his expression that the blade had landed where it should. But then, rather than retreat, I chose the kind of revenge that doesn't bruise the body but rewrites the record. I pulled out my phone, snapped a photo of the trunk, and drafted a post in real time, explaining that the very box of journals once dismissed as childish had been preserved all along by the man who couldn't say he believed. And that sometimes the people who mock your dreams are also the ones who secretly hoard the evidence, because a part of them fears your success even as they deny it. Within minutes the photo began to ripple outward, my followers dissecting it as both reconciliation and indictment, praising me for grace or calling me cruel for airing what should have been private. But I didn't delete it because it wasn't meant for strangers, it was meant for him, a mirror he couldn't ignore, one that framed him as both protector and saboteur in the same breath. He read it as the notifications dinged on his own phone, and for a moment I thought he might storm off, but instead he nodded once, muttered that maybe truth was the only currency worth trading this late in life, and walked away toward his car, leaving the trunk and me with the burden of deciding what to carry forward. Back at my apartment, I opened the trunk and began leafing through pages filled with scribbles that alternated between hopeless and brilliant, the sketches of a younger me who still believed she could build something even when no one clapped, and I realized that revenge, when performed with clarity, isn't just punishment for the past, but an insurance policy for the future. Yet the more I sorted, the more uneasy I became, because hidden among the notebooks was an envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting, a letter I had never seen, sealed but dated a decade ago, and as I held it, the phone lit again with another cascade of messages, this time not from strangers or sponsors, but from my brother Mark, who apparently had decided the time was ripe for his own brand of intervention. The subject line of his message was simple and smug, "So you really think you won?" The message from Mark arrived not with surprise, but with the weary inevitability of a man who had always preferred to turn other people's victories into his own stage for commentary, and as I read the smug subject line declaring that I really thought I had won, I felt the same mixture of anger and dark amusement that had followed me since childhood when he managed to twist every achievement into evidence of his supposed superiority. He wrote at length about how family bonds could not be erased by grandstanding speeches, how my viral moment was nothing more than a flash in a pan, and how the real power lay in legacy, in being the one who stayed close to our parents while I played at independence. He ended by claiming that I had embarrassed the family name, as if the family name had ever been a shield rather than a leash, and he threatened to set the record straight in his own carefully curated way. Reading his words was like opening a time capsule of old wounds, yet instead of letting the bile take root, I leaned back, folded the letter from my mother that I had just discovered on my desk, and realized that the true revenge here would not be fire but precision, not chaos, but a calculated choice to reveal what he feared most: irrelevance. The unopened envelope from my mother trembled in my hands as though it carried more weight than its paper frame should have been able to hold, and though I hesitated, afraid of finding apologies that arrived far too late, I finally tore it open and unfolded a letter written in her distinct, looping script. It was dated 10 years earlier, a time when I had been at my lowest, when the company was little more than an idea scrawled on stained pages, and inside she confessed that while my father doubted and my brother sneered, she had believed quietly but lacked the courage to say so aloud. She admitted that fear of ridicule from her own husband had silenced her, that she had hidden behind the safer choice of complicity, and she begged me, should I ever read those words, not to mistake her silence for absence of love. The letter broke me in a way the empty seats never could, because it was proof that behind the facade of dismissal, someone had carried faith but had wrapped it in cowardice, until the years buried it too deep to matter. I sat there staring at her handwriting, knowing she had chosen never to deliver it, and wondered whether to count it as comfort or cruelty, a secret belief that offered no protection when I needed it most. Mark's threats to expose me for bitterness collided in my mind with the revelation of my mother's hidden support, and I felt the contours of the dilemma sharpen. I could engage him publicly, let him play his tired role as the favored son protecting the family's honor, or I could make a quieter, sharper incision, one that left him gasping for relevance while I walked away untouched. I chose the latter. I composed a short, razor-edged post that simply featured a photograph of my mother's letter, with her handwriting visible, but the words blurred beyond recognition, accompanied only by the caption, "Not all belief is spoken aloud, but silence has its own cost." It was ambiguous enough to set imagination spinning, yet powerful enough to undercut his narrative before he could even publish it, because it suggested hidden truths, unspoken alliances, and fractures that he could not control. Within an hour, the responses flooded in readers speculating, sympathizers sharing stories of parents who secretly believed but failed to act, and critics accusing me of manipulation. But in every case, Mark's voice was drowned in the swell, his attempt at control slipping through his hands like water. As the day waned, I sat with the award glinting under the last stretch of sunlight, the trunk of journals opened at my feet, the blurred image of my mother's letter already circulating beyond my command, and the unanswered message from my father still waiting in my inbox. My phone pulsed without pause, apologies from old classmates, invitations from colleagues, strangers declaring that my words had given them courage, and even journalists asking whether the blurred letter would ever be revealed. My inbox was no longer simply full. It was a flood that threatened to reshape the very banks of my life. Yet as I stared at it, I felt the ambiguity close in around me like a fog. I had wanted vindication, and I had achieved it. I had wanted revenge, and I had executed it with precision. But I did not feel the satisfaction of final victory, only the disorienting awareness that triumph had opened more doors than it had closed, and behind each one stood another demand, another interpretation, another expectation I had not invited. I hovered my finger over the reply button to my father's message, the screen reflecting both the award and the blurred letter beside me, and I realized that this was the moment of choice, the place where clarity should have come but refused to. If I answered him, I would be dragged back into a story that never gave me permission to be myself. If I ignored him, I would become the villain in a script he would happily hand to Mark for safekeeping. And if I revealed the full letter, I might finally prove that even silence had once been faith, but I would also expose my mother's cowardice to strangers who would dissect it like vultures. My inbox continued to flood, my phone vibrating in relentless bursts, and all I could do was sit there staring, realizing that perhaps the truest revenge was not in answering at all, but in making them live with the silence they had written into my life. Whether that silence would liberate me or imprison me was the one question I knew the world could not answer for me, and so I let the phone buzz on the table, untouched, while the room filled with the low hum of a life I had built alone.